Rain fell over Seoul in thin silver needles, the kind that didn't soak you all at once but crept into your bones over an hour, and Keiza Yue's had been standing in it for 40 minutes. She adjusted the strap of Amara's diaper bag on her shoulder for the third time, glancing down at her daughter, who was humming to herself and stomping in a puddle like it was the happiest discovery of her short life. "Amara, baby, we have to be careful. Mommy has an interview." Interview. Amara repeated the word the way she repeated everything lately, delighted by its shape in her mouth, not at all understanding what it meant. She was 4 years old, all cheeks and energy, her hair in two puffy twists her mother had done that morning before the sun came up, little yellow beads clacking together every time she moved her head. Keiza allowed herself a small breath before pressing the buzzer at the gate of the address she'd been given. The gate itself was intimidating, black iron, twice her height, flanked by stone walls with cameras mounted every few meters. She had expected a nice house. She had not expected a fortress. A man's voice crackled through the intercom, flat and suspicious. "Name and business." "Keiza Yue's. I'm here about the housekeeping position. The agency sent me." A pause. Longer than it should have been. Then the gate groaned and slid open. She had come to Seoul 2 years ago on a scholarship to study international business at a university in Sinchon, dreaming of the kind of future her mother back in Kigali used to whisper about over evening tea. "You will make something of yourself, Keiza. You will make us proud." She had not planned on falling in love with a boy from her cohort, an exchange student from Busan named Juno, and she certainly had not planned on being 4 months pregnant and utterly alone when he vanished back to his hometown without so much as a text message, blocking every number she had. She had not planned on Amara, either. But now that Amara existed, laughing and stomping in puddles and calling everything interview, Keiza could not imagine a version of her life without her. What she could not afford was rent, tuition, and childcare on money earned making iced coffee at a cafe near Ua Women's University. So when the agency called and said a private household in Songbuk-dong was looking for a live-in housekeeper, good pay, discretion required, immediate start, she had swallowed her pride and her nerves and said yes before asking a single question about who she'd be working for. She should have asked. The estate beyond the gate looked less like a home and more like something out of a film about generals, a low, sprawling Hanok-style main house with a modern wing built onto its side, manicured pine trees, security men in dark suits stationed at intervals like they'd grown out of the ground. One of them, broad-shouldered with a scar through his eyebrow, approached her with his hands folded in front of him. "You're the new maid? I'm here for the interview, yes." His eyes flicked to Amara. Something shifted in his face, surprise, maybe pity. "You brought a kid. I couldn't find a sitter on short notice. I was told I could bring her, just for today, to meet whoever. Follow me." He didn't finish her sentence, just turned on his heel. They were led through a side door into a kitchen larger than Keiza's entire apartment, all dark wood and steel, and told to wait. Amara wandered immediately to the window, pressing her nose to the glass to look at the garden, narrating to herself in the mixture of Kinyarwanda and Korean she'd absorbed from daycare and her mother in equal parts. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Finally, a woman in her 50s entered, sharp-suited, her expression unreadable. She introduced herself only as Mrs. Han, head of household staff. "You understand what kind of household this is?" Keiza hesitated. The agency said, "Private residence. High-profile family." Mrs. Han's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "That is one way to say it. Mr. Kong does not receive many visitors. He does not like noise. He does not like questions. He especially does not like." Her eyes moved to Amara, still chattering at the window. "Children underfoot. I understand. She won't be coming to work with me. I only brought her today because I know why you brought her." Mrs. Han's tone softened by exactly 1 degree. "Sit. I will explain the position, and then you will decide if you still want it." Most who hear the terms do not. The terms, as it turned out, were this. Keza would live in a small staff apartment on the property, 6 days a week, 1 day off. She would cook, clean, and manage the household schedule for a Mr. Kang Diyun, the sole resident of the main house. She was warned, in language so careful it felt rehearsed, that Mr. Kang was disabled following an accident, that he was in a wheelchair, that he rarely left his study, and that he had gone through 4 housekeepers in 8 months, each of whom had quit or been dismissed for reasons Mrs. Han declined to specify. What Mrs. Han did not say. What Keza would only learn weeks later, in fragments, from whispered warnings among the other staff, was that Kang Diyun was not merely a wealthy recluse. He was the head of the Baek Ho, one of the most feared organizations in the country, a man whose name alone had once made rival bosses reroute their entire operations rather than risk crossing him. Had been. Past tense. 6 months ago, a bullet meant for his skull had instead shattered his spine. He had survived, barely, and only because his loyal lieutenant, Park Chol-soo, had gotten him into surgery within the hour, but he had not walked since, and in the world Kang Dun ruled, a boss who could not stand on his own 2 feet was a boss who invited every ambitious underling and rival gang to start circling like vultures. He had grown, in these 6 months, into something the staff spoke of only in lowered voices, a ghost who screamed when disturbed, who fired anyone who looked at him with pity, who had not smiled, had not, some said, even spoken more than a sentence to another human being who wasn't Chol-soo, since the day he woke up in that hospital bed and understood what he had lost. Keza knew none of this yet. All she knew was that the pay was more than double what the cafe offered, that room and board were included, and that she was desperate enough not to ask too many questions. "I'll take it," she said. Mrs. Han studied her for a long moment. "You should know. The last woman who worked here left in tears. The one before her, he called security to remove from the property at midnight because she asked if he needed help getting into bed. He does not want help, Miss Uwais. He wants to be left alone. Can you do that?" Keza thought of her rent due in 11 days. She thought of Amara's shoes, a size too small, that she couldn't yet afford to replace. "Yes," she said, "I can do that." She had no idea, in that moment, just how wrong she would turn out to be. Her first 3 days, she did not see him at all. She was given a tour by Mrs. Han of the parts of the house she was permitted to enter: the kitchen, the laundry room, the main hallways, the guest wing where she would sleep in a narrow but clean room adjoining Amara's daycare pickup schedule, which the agency had, mercifully, helped her arrange nearby. She was shown which door led to his study and told, with unusual bluntness, "You do not go past that door unless summoned. Meals are left on the tray outside it. He collects them himself. He doesn't eat with anyone. He doesn't do anything with anyone," Mrs. Han said, and walked away before Keza could ask what that meant. On the 4th day, she heard him for the first time. A voice, low and rough, raised behind the closed study door, snapping something in rapid Korean at Chol-soo, the wiry, watchful man who seemed to be the only person Kang Diyun tolerated. She didn't catch all the words, but she caught the tone, exhausted fury, the kind that had nowhere left to go, so it curdled inward instead. She left his lunch tray at the door as instructed and hurried away before he could open it. On the 5th day, curiosity, or maybe something else, something she couldn't name yet, made her linger a half-second too long after knocking, and the door opened before she could retreat. He was in a wheelchair, positioned at an angle so the light from the window fell across half his face and left the other half in shadow. And even in that half-light, she understood immediately why the staff spoke of him the way they did. He had the kind of face that had clearly, once, commanded rooms without effort. Sharp jaw, dark eyes set deep and assessing. The build of a man who'd trained his whole life to be dangerous. Even folded into a wheelchair, even with a blanket draped uselessly over legs that no longer obeyed him, There was something coiled and lethal in the way he held himself, like a blade sheathed but not dulled. His eyes moved over her, unreadable, and then narrowed. "Who are you?" Not a question, a demand. "Keza Uwais, sir. The new housekeeper. I'm sorry, I was just leaving your. I didn't ask your name." His voice was flat, bored, cruel in its indifference. "I asked who let a foreigner into my house." The words landed exactly where he intended them to. Keza had lived in Korea long enough to have absorbed plenty of stares, plenty of comments muttered just loud enough to be heard on the subway, plenty of children pointing at her afro and their mothers not correcting them. She had built calluses over the parts of herself that used to flinch. But something about the deliberate coldness in his voice, the way he said foreigner like it explained everything he needed to know about her, still found the raw place underneath the callus. "Mrs. Han hired me," she said, keeping her voice level. "If there's a problem, you can take it up with her. Your lunch is on the tray." She turned and walked away before he could respond, her heart hammering, and did not look back to see the expression on his face, something between surprise and, though she would never have believed it, the faintest and most unwilling flicker of interest. No one spoke back to Kang Du-yun. No one had, in years. That night, in the small staff room with Amara asleep beside her, Keza lay awake staring at the ceiling and wondered, for the first time since accepting the job, if she'd made a mistake. She thought of calling the agency in the morning. She thought of the rent due in 6 days. She thought of Amara's outgrown shoes. She stayed. For the first 2 weeks, Keza's life fell into a rhythm. Up before dawn to prepare breakfast, drop Amara at the daycare 2 streets over, return to clean and cook and manage the household's endless small demands, pick Amara up in the evening, put her to bed, collapse. She saw Kang Du-yun only at a distance, a shape behind a cracked door, a voice down the hall, once the back of his wheelchair disappearing into the garden at an hour so late, she assumed he thought no one was awake to see him. She learned things about him despite herself, the way you learn the shape of a house by living in it. He did not sleep well. She heard him some nights, restless, the wheels of his chair creaking against the floor as he moved from one room to another and back, unable to settle. He drank his coffee black and cold, refusing to let it be reheated, as though even a small comfort like warmth was something he'd decided he no longer deserved. He read. She saw the books piled beside his study door when she collected the trays, philosophy mostly, some history, nothing that suggested a man planning to build a future, only a man trying to understand a past. And he was, without exception, furious at everyone. He fired the gardener for whistling. He reduced one of the security men to a stammering apology for parking a car 3 centimeters out of its usual space. He once left Keza a note, because by then he'd stopped speaking to her directly except when necessary, informing her that the tea she'd prepared was an insult to tea, and that she was to never make it that way again, though he never specified what way she'd made it or what way he wanted instead. She kept her head down. She did her job. She told herself this was temporary, a stepping stone, money for rent and shoes and the tuition payment due at the end of the semester. Then, on a gray Tuesday in her 3rd week, the daycare called. Amara had a fever. Not dangerous, the woman on the phone assured her, just a normal childhood fever, but they couldn't keep her there, and could Keza please come collect her within the hour? Keza had no one to call, no family in the country, no friends close enough to ask for something like this on short notice, and Mrs. Han, when Keza found her, only pressed her lips into a thin line. "Mr. Kang does not allow children on the property. You know this." "I know, but there's no one else, and I have nowhere to bring her, and it will only be for a few hours until. It is not my decision. It's his." And so, for the first time since her interview, Keza found herself standing outside the study door with her feverish, sniffling 4-year-old on her hip, about to ask the most feared and most furious man in Seoul for a favor. She knocked. There was a long pause before the voice, low and irritated, said, What? She opened the door only enough to speak through the gap. Mr. Kong, I'm sorry to disturb you. My daughter is sick. The daycare can't keep her, and I have no one to watch her while I finish my shift. I only need a corner somewhere quiet. She'll be no trouble, I promise. No. The word was final, flat, already dismissing her. She should have closed the door and figured something else out. She should have called in sick herself and accepted whatever consequences came with it. But Amara, feverish and cranky and unaware of who exactly she was addressing, chose that moment to push the door open further with her small hand and peer inside, blinking against the dim light of the study. "Why you sit down all the time?" she asked, in the blunt, guileless way only a 4-year-old could manage, looking at the wheelchair with open curiosity rather than the careful non-reaction adults had learned to perform. "Is it comfy?" Silence. Keza froze, mortified, already reaching to pull her daughter back and apologize 6 different ways. But something in the room had shifted, some tension she couldn't name, and when she looked up, Kong Din was staring at Amara with an expression she had genuinely never seen on his face before. Not fury, not irritation, but a kind of stunned, wrong-footed silence, as though someone had asked him a question in a language he'd forgotten he understood. "It's not comfy," he said finally, his voice strange, quieter than she'd heard it. "It's not a choice." Oh. Amara considered this with the grave seriousness only small children could bring to information they didn't fully grasp. "That's sad. Do you want a hug?" "My mommy says hugs help when things are sad." "Amara," Keza started, horrified, already pulling her back. "No." Kong Duyun's voice cut through, sharper this time but not, Keza noted with confusion, aimed at Amara. He was looking at Keza now, something unreadable in his dark eyes. "Leave her." In the corner, on the chair by the window. "She is not to touch anything. She is not to make noise. And she is not." His gaze flicked to Amara, then back, something almost like discomfort in it. "To ask me any more questions." Keza blinked. "You're allowing it." "I'm allowing it once," he said, already turning his chair back toward his desk, dismissing her. "Don't make me regret it." Amara, of course, could not sit quietly in a corner for more than 11 minutes. Keza learned this later, piecing it together from a flustered Mrs. Han and a bewildered Chol Su, both of whom had happened to be passing the study at various points and had, through the gap in the door, witnessed things neither of them had words for. Amara had asked Kong Diyun what his name was. He'd ignored her for 6 minutes before finally, tersely, answering. She had asked why his room was so dark, and, receiving no answer, had gotten up, despite being told not to touch anything, and opened the curtains herself, flooding the study with the first natural daylight it had seen in months, an act that should have gotten her thrown out of the house, and instead was met, according to Chul Su's astonished retelling, with nothing. No shout, no fury, just silence, and Kong Diyun looking at the light on his desk like he'd forgotten what it looked like. She had, at some point, produced a small stuffed rabbit from her bag, worn thin from years of love, one ear chewed nearly off, and placed it on the edge of his desk so you're not lonely, before curling up on the window seat and falling asleep in the fevered, boneless way only sick children could manage. When Keza came to collect her 2 hours later, hard in her throat, expecting to find her daughter banished or worse, she found instead Kong Din sitting exactly where she'd left him, working through papers with his usual scowl, the stuffed rabbit still perched on the corner of his desk, untouched and unthrown away, and her daughter asleep and safe. He did not look up. Don't bring her again. But he did not throw the rabbit out either, and 3 days later, when Keza came to collect the lunch tray, she found it had been moved, not discarded, but set carefully on the bookshelf, propped up between 2 volumes of what looked like Korean legal history, facing the door like it was keeping watch. She said nothing about it, but something in her chest, something she didn't examine too closely, softened toward the impossible man in the dark room. The fever passed, as fevers did, and the daycare reopened its doors, and Keza told herself the strange afternoon in Kong Dun's study was a closed chapter, an anomaly born of desperation, not to be repeated. Amara had other plans. It started small. A drawing, done at daycare with crayons that bled through the paper, of a stick figure in what was unmistakably meant to be a wheelchair, surrounded by yellow scribbles Amara insisted was sunshine for the sad man. She begged her mother to deliver it. "Baby, Mr. Kong doesn't want. He kept my rabbit," Amara said, with the unshakable logic of a 4-year-old who had decided something was true. "He likes me. Please, Mommy." Keza should have said no. She thought about all the reasons to say no as she stood outside the study door 2 days later with the drawing folded in her apron pocket, working up the nerve to knock, telling herself she was only bringing the afternoon tea, that the drawing was incidental, that she wasn't really doing this because some soft, cracked open part of her wanted to see what would happen if she did. She knocked. He didn't answer, which by now she'd learned meant come in if you must. I won't dignify it with a response. She entered, set the tray down, and, before she could talk herself out of it, placed the folded drawing beside it. "From Amara," she said. "She wanted you to have it." She turned to leave. His voice, low, stopped her. "Is she still sick?" Not "how is she?" Not warmth. But a question, unprompted, and from a man who asked nothing of anyone. Keza turned back, startled. "No. She's better. Back at daycare." He grunted something that might have been acknowledgement and unfolded the drawing with the careful, almost reluctant motions of a man handling something he wasn't sure he was allowed to want. He looked at it for a long moment. The crooked stick figure, the aggressive yellow crayon sunshine, the crayon hearts scattered across the top with no apparent logic to their placement. "Tell her," he said finally, voice rough in a way that had nothing to do with irritation, "that I don't need sunshine." But he did not hand the drawing back. And 2 weeks later, when Keza came to change the bedsheets in his room, a task she was permitted only when he was in his study and unlikely to notice, she found it taped, carefully, unevenly, to the inside of his wardrobe door, where visitors would never see it, but where he would, every single morning, when he reached for his clothes. After that, something between them began, slowly, to change, though neither of them would have called it that at the time. He still snapped at her over small things. He still refused help he clearly needed. She watched him struggle for 4 full minutes to reach a book on a high shelf using a mechanical grabber arm, rather than ask her to hand it to him, his jaw tight, with a fury that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with his own body's betrayal. He still ate alone, still worked past midnight, still moved through the house like a man serving a sentence he had no hope of commuting. But he began, in small and grudging ways, to permit Amara's presence. Not officially. He never once said, "Bring your daughter," never softened the rule he'd laid down that first day. But when the daycare had a half day, and Keza had nowhere else to bring her, he did not object when Amara set up her coloring books on the floor of his study, chattering to herself, occasionally to him, and receiving, more often than either of them expected, an actual answer. "What color is your favorite?" she asked him one afternoon, holding up a fistful of crayons for his inspection. He looked at them for a long moment, at this small human who had, somehow, wedged herself into his life like a splinter he'd stopped trying to remove. "Black," he said finally. "It doesn't show dirt." "That's not a real reason," Amara informed him, with the devastating honesty of childhood. "You have to pick because it's pretty." He almost smiled. Keza, watching from the doorway with an armful of laundry, saw it. The flicker at the corner of his mouth before he caught it and smoothed it away, as though smiling was a muscle he'd let atrophy and didn't trust to hold his weight. "Blue then," he said. "Like the sky. Since apparently that matters to you." "Good choice," Amara said solemnly, and handed him a blue crayon, and went back to her coloring as though she had not, in that small exchange, cracked something open in a man who had not let anyone close enough to crack in over half a year. Keza said nothing. But that night, lying awake beside her sleeping daughter, she found herself thinking about the almost smile far longer than was sensible. It was Chul-Soo who finally told her. He found her in the kitchen one evening, long after the rest of the household had gone quiet, nursing a cup of tea she'd made herself, too tired to sleep and too wound up to try. He was a wiry man in his 40s, weathered in the particular way of someone who'd spent decades in a dangerous profession and outlived most of his peers, and he regarded her now with an expression she couldn't quite place. Assessment, maybe, or a kind of cautious respect. "You know what he was," he said. Not a question. Keza set down her cup. "I know what the other staff whisper. I don't know what's true." Chul-Soo pulled out a chair across from her and sat, uninvited but not unwelcome. "Baek Ho," he said. "White Tiger. You've heard the name?" She had. Everyone in Seoul, even foreigners who tried not to pay attention to such things, had heard the name whispered in connection with the parts of the city polite conversation didn't touch. Construction contracts that fell suspiciously into certain hands, disputes settled outside any courtroom, a network of influence that reached, some said, into police stations and city hall alike. He built it from nothing, Chul-Soo said, and there was something like grim pride in his voice. His father was a nobody, a debt collector for men with more power than sense. Do-yoon watched his father get beaten half to death over a debt that wasn't even his when he was 12 years old, and swore he would never again be the kind of man other men could hurt without consequence. By 25, he ran half the syndicate south of the river. By 30, the other half fell in line rather than fight him. And now, Chul-Soo's face darkened. 6 months ago, someone he trusted, someone close enough to walk into his own office, put a bullet in him. Should have killed him instantly. Instead, it caught his spine. He exhaled, long and slow. He built an empire on being untouchable, Miss Uwais. And now every rival who ever feared him is waiting to see how long a boss who cannot walk can hold on to what he built. Some of his own men, too. Loyalty in this world lasts exactly as long as fear does. Keza sat with this for a long moment, turning her cup slowly in her hands. That's why no one comes near him. Why he doesn't let anyone help him. He thinks help is proof of weakness. That the moment anyone sees him needing it, the word will spread, and the wolves currently circling at the edges of his territory will smell blood and close in. Chul-Soo's eyes met hers, steady and serious. "I tell you this because I've watched him these past months become something I don't recognize. A man who used to command respect with a look now flinches, Miss Uwais, from pity. He is drowning. And I have watched him, for the first time since the shooting, smile at that child of yours." Keza's throat tightened. "I didn't know about any of it. I'm not warning you off," Chul-Soo said, standing. "I'm telling you because I think you should understand what you're dealing with before you get in any deeper. This is not a sad rich man in a big house. This is a man other men fear enough to kill. Being close to him is not safe. It has never been safe." He paused at the door. "But I have also never seen him choose the drawing of a 4-year-old over a folder of numbers that could lose him half his territory. So, make of that what you will." He left her alone with her cooling tea and a great deal to think about. 2 weeks later, everything changed, not with a single dramatic moment, but with an ordinary Tuesday evening that neither of them saw coming. Amara had a school project, a simple thing, drawing a picture of someone who is brave for her daycare's Helpers in Our Lives unit, and had, with the singular focus of a 4-year-old who had made up her mind, decided the bravest person she knew was Mr. Kong, because he doesn't cry even when his legs don't work, and Mommy says that's the bravest kind of brave. Keza had tried, gently, to redirect her toward a firefighter or a doctor, something age-appropriate and simple, but Amara was immovable, And so Keza found herself once again standing outside the study door, this time not to ask a favor, but to explain, apologetically, why her daughter wanted to interview the most feared man in Seoul for a preschool assignment. To her surprise, he agreed. What followed was, by any measure, one of the strangest afternoons of Kang De-yoon's adult life. He sat, stiff and visibly uncomfortable with the entire premise, while a 4-year-old with crayons and a spiral notebook asked him increasingly unfilterable questions. Does it hurt when your legs don't work? Do you miss walking? Did you cry when it happened? Is being sad like a rain cloud or a big rock? And, to Keza's growing astonishment, answered nearly all of them, haltingly at first and then, as the afternoon wore on, with something that looked almost like relief. It's like a rock, he said finally, in answer to the rain cloud or rock question, staring at some point past Amara's shoulder. It doesn't go away. You just learn to carry it, or it crushes you. That sounds heavy, Amara said, with 4-year-old solemnity. It is. Do you want help carrying it? The question hung in the air. Keza, standing in the doorway with a laundry basket balanced on her hip, felt something in her chest twist painfully. She saw Kang De-yoon's jaw tighten, saw the old, familiar wall begin to rise behind his eyes. The same wall that had turned away for housekeepers, that had made grown men flinch from his temper, that had kept an entire household at careful arm's length for 6 months. And then, astonishingly, she watched it falter. I don't know how to let anyone, he said, so quietly she almost missed it. I've never had to. Amara, entirely unaware of the weight of what had just been said, simply nodded and drew, with great concentration, a picture of a stick figure with a crown on its head sitting in a wheelchair, surrounded by more of her signature aggressive yellow sunshine scribbles. There, she said, holding it up proudly. Now you're a king. Kings are brave and they let people help them, because that's what the people around a king are for. Kang De-yoon stared at the drawing for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual, and he did not look at either of them when he said it. Take her home. It's getting late. But Keza, gathering her daughter's things, caught the way his hand lingered over the drawing before he said it, with the others on the shelf beside the wardrobe. That night, after Amara was asleep, Keza found herself summoned, properly summoned, for the first time, by a note left with Mrs. Han asking her to come to the study once the house had settled. She went, heart in her throat, unsure what to expect. She found him by the window, staring out at the dark garden, his chair angled so the last of the evening light caught the sharp lines of his profile. Sit, he said, without turning. She sat, carefully, in the chair across from his desk, the one Amara usually claimed for her coloring. Your daughter, he said finally, asked me today if I wanted help carrying something. I'm sorry if she overstepped. She doesn't always understand. She understood better than anyone in this house has in 6 months. He turned to face her then, and the vulnerability in his expression was so raw, so unguarded, that Keza almost looked away out of instinct, out of the sense that she was witnessing something not meant for her. Everyone here treats me like I'm made of glass, or like I'm a bomb about to go off. Chulsu pretends nothing has changed. My men pretend they still fear me the way they used to. You, he paused, searching for the word. You flinch, sometimes, but you don't pretend. And your daughter doesn't pretend at all. She just asks the question everyone else is too afraid to ask. Keza said nothing, unsure if he wanted a response or simply needed to say the words aloud. I was someone once, he continued, voice low, almost to himself. Men feared my name before they ever saw my face. I built something out of nothing with these hands. He looked down at them, resting uselessly in his lap along with the legs that no longer obeyed him. And now I can't even reach a book on a shelf without a machine to do it for me. Do you know what that does to a man? To go from untouchable to this? No, Keza said honestly. But I know what it's like to build something out of nothing and watch it get taken from you anyway. I came here with a scholarship, a plan, a future I could see clearly. I lost most of it in 1 year. The man I loved, my sense of safety, the life I thought I was building. What I have left is my daughter and whatever I can make with my own 2 hands, one day at a time. It's not the same as what happened to you. But I understand something about starting over from less than you had. He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his dark eyes. Not pity, she realized with relief, because pity was the one thing he could not tolerate, but something closer to recognition. Why do you stay? He asked. I've been nothing but difficult since the day you arrived. Keza considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. At first, because I needed the money. Now, she hesitated, unsure how much truth to offer a man who held so much power and so much danger in his hands. Now I think I stay because I've seen what's underneath the difficulty. My daughter saw it before I did. She's better at seeing people than I am. Sometimes. Something that might have been the ghost of a real smile crossed his face. She sees a king in a wheelchair. Most people just see the wheelchair. Most people are wrong, Keza said simply, and stood to leave before either of them could say anything that couldn't be unsaid. Word travels in the underworld the way it travels everywhere else. Through whispers, through weakness sensed rather than announced, through the small accumulating evidence that a man once untouchable had become merely a man. Kong Diyun's territory had, for 6 months, held together on reputation alone, on the lingering fear of what he had once been capable of, on Chulsu's careful management of the day-to-day business, on bluffs and old debts of loyalty that everyone knew, eventually, would run out. It ran out on a Thursday. Keza was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard raised voices from the front of the house. Not the familiar cadence of household staff, but something sharper, angrier, punctuated by the particular quality of tension that made the hair on her arms rise. She left the stove and moved to the hallway, where she found Chulsu and 2 of the security men standing rigid before a group of unfamiliar men in dark suits, one of whom, older, silver-haired, with the easy, contemptuous posture of someone who believed he'd already won, was speaking in the low, controlled tone of a man delivering an ultimatum rather than a request. Tell Kong Diyun that Sang-chul sends his regards and his patience. 6 months, Chulsu. 6 months we've waited for your boss to either recover or step aside gracefully. The Chanji territory does not run itself. If he cannot hold it, others will, and we would rather this be settled with paperwork than with blood. But we are prepared for either. He hears you, Chulsu said, jaw tight. Give him time. Time is the one thing a cripple does not have the luxury of granting himself, Sang-chul said, and something in his tone made Keza's stomach turn cold. Tell him he has 1 week to appear. In person, not through you, not through some lawyer's letter, and demonstrate he still commands what he claims to command. Or we begin taking it, piece by piece, starting with whatever is easiest to reach. His eyes flicked, deliberately, toward the hallway where Keza stood frozen, and toward the sound of Amara's distant laughter drifting from the playroom where she'd been left with a picture book while her mother worked. Something ugly and knowing crossed his face. Whatever is easiest to reach, he repeated, softer this time, and left without waiting for a response. Keza's blood ran cold. She hurried to the playroom, gathered Amara into her arms far more tightly than the moment called for, and did not let go for a long time. That night, she went to Kong Diyun's study without being summoned, something she had never done before, and found him already aware of everything. Chulsu had reported the confrontation in full, and Diyun sat rigid in his chair, his face a mask of controlled fury that Keza recognized now as the particular fear of a man who had spent his whole life being the danger in the room and had just been reminded, in the ugliest possible way, that he no longer was. You should leave, he said, before she could speak. You and your daughter. Tonight, if possible. Somewhere far from this house. Because of what that man said. Because he meant every word. Men like Oh Sang-chul do not make idle threats to remind a rival of his weakness. If he thinks touching you or your daughter is the fastest way to force my hand, he will do it without hesitation, and his voice cracked, just slightly, the first real crack she had heard in it. I cannot protect you the way I once could have. I cannot even stand to defend my own home. So your solution is to send us away. My solution is to keep you alive. His hands, resting on the arms of his chair, curled into fists. Do you understand what I am? What I built my entire life around becoming. I made myself into something men feared so that no one could ever again do to the people around me what was done to my father. And now, because of one bullet, the very thing I built to protect people has become the reason you and your daughter are in danger. Do you understand the particular hell of that, Keza? It was the first time he had used her given name. She noted it even through her fear, even through the cold dread pooling in her stomach at the thought of Amara. Sweet, fearless, sunshine-scribbling Amara. Anywhere near the kind of danger Oh Sang-chul represented. I understand, she said carefully, that you're afraid. I understand that fear is making you want to push us away because you think that protects us. But running doesn't make us safer if this man is determined, and staying doesn't make us less safe if you refuse to fight for what's yours. She stepped closer, kneeling slightly so she was at eye level with him, an act of deliberate equality she saw register in his expression. You said you built an empire so no one could ever again hurt the people you cared about the way your father was hurt. So don't hide from this fight because you're afraid of losing it. Find another way to win it. I can't even walk into a meeting on my own 2 feet. Then walk in on wheels. And make them remember why they used to be afraid of your mind before they were ever afraid of your fists. Her voice was fierce now, urgent. The man Amara draws pictures of isn't brave because his legs work. He's brave because he refuses to disappear even when everyone expects him to. Be that man in front of Oh Sang-chul, not the man who's already decided he's lost. He stared at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded moving behind his eyes. Fear, yes, but also, underneath it, the faintest ember of something that looked almost like hope. You would ask me to fight, he said slowly, even though it puts you and your daughter directly in the path of every enemy I have. I'm asking you not to give up on yourself, she said, because I think, somewhere underneath everything that's happened to you, you haven't fully given up. And I think my daughter would be very disappointed in her king if he did. Something in his face broke open then, not into tears, not into any dramatic display, but into a kind of quiet, devastated honesty she suspected very few people had ever been permitted to witness. I don't know how to be that man anymore, he admitted. I don't know if he still exists. Then let's find out together, Keza said, and reached out, slowly, giving him every chance to pull away, and rested her hand over his clenched fist until, after a long moment, it loosened beneath her palm. Neither of them spoke of what that touch meant, but neither of them moved away from it, either. The week that followed was unlike anything the household had seen since Kang Diyun's injury. He began, for the first time in 6 months, actually working, not the fitful, avoidant paperwork he'd been pushing through out of obligation, but real strategy, calling in old contacts, reviewing every asset and alliance the Baekho still held, mapping out precisely what Oh Sang-chul's organization could and couldn't survive without. Chul-soo, initially stunned by the sudden change, quickly fell into step, bringing files, making calls, working alongside his boss with the focused intensity of a man who'd been waiting 6 months for exactly this. Keza watched it happen with a strange mixture of pride and fear. Pride at seeing the sharp, formidable intelligence Chul-soo had described finally reassert itself. Fear at understanding exactly what kind of confrontation they were building toward, and what it would mean if it failed. Amara, blissfully unaware of the stakes, continued to visit the study most afternoons, her presence now so normalized that Mrs. Han no longer even blinked at it. And in the small pockets of time between strategy sessions, Kaiza noticed something that made her chest ache with a tenderness she hadn't expected to feel for this hardened, dangerous, wounded man. He was gentler with Amara than with anyone else in his life. He let her braid a single, comically lopsided section of his hair with the beads she'd insisted on donating from her own collection. He answered her endless questions with a patience he showed no one else. Once, when she fell asleep on the study floor mid-coloring, exhausted from a full day at daycare, Kaiza came to find him with his chair maneuvered as close to her as the desk would allow, one hand resting, feather-light, on her small back, as though standing guard over her sleep. He looked up when Kaiza entered, something almost sheepish in his expression, as if caught doing something he wasn't sure he was allowed to do. "She fell asleep," he said, unnecessarily. "I see that." Kaiza crossed the room and knelt to gather her daughter into her arms. As she straightened, her eyes met his, and something passed between them, unspoken, enormous, neither of them ready yet to name it. "Thank you," she said softly, "for watching over her. She makes it easy to forget, for a little while, what's coming." His voice was quiet, almost confessional. "I haven't let myself forget anything in 6 months. It's a strange kind of relief." "Then let yourself have it," Kaiza said. "Just for tonight." For days before the deadline Sang-chul had given, disaster nearly struck. Kaiza was walking Amara home from daycare, a short, familiar route she'd walked dozens of times, when a black car slowed beside them, window lowering just enough to reveal a face she recognized from that terrible evening in the hallway. Sang-chul himself, or one of his men wearing his same cold, contemptuous smile. "Miss Uwais," the man said, his Korean accented with the particular smoothness of someone used to being obeyed. "Perhaps you and your lovely daughter would like a ride home. It would save you the walk. And save your employer a great deal of trouble, if he understood we could reach either of you whenever we chose." Every instinct in Kaiza's body screamed to run, but running with a 4-year-old on quiet residential streets against a car was no contest at all, and so she did the only thing she could think to do. She gripped Amara's hand tightly, kept her voice as calm and unbothered as she could force it to be, and said, "We're almost home. But thank you for the offer." She did not run. She walked, deliberately, unhurriedly, toward the busier street 2 blocks ahead where there would be witnesses, shopkeepers, the ordinary chaos of city life that even men like Sang-chul preferred not to disturb in broad daylight. The car followed at a slow, deliberate crawl for the length of the block, a message, not yet an attack, before finally peeling away. Kaiza did not tell Amara what had happened. She scooped her up, held her far tighter than the moment called for, and hurried the rest of the way home with her heart slamming against her ribs. She told Kang Diyun that evening, watching his face transform from controlled tension into something closer to barely leashed violence. Not directed at her, she understood immediately, but at himself, at his own helplessness, at the unbearable knowledge that people he had come to care for had been threatened because of who he was. "That's it," he said, voice shaking with restrained fury. "You're both leaving this house tonight. I don't care what it costs me. I don't care what it looks like to Sang-chul. I will not let anything happen to either of you because of my war." "No," Kaiza said, more firmly than she expected herself capable of. "Running now, after they've already shown they know exactly where to find us, doesn't make us safer. It makes us look weak and gives them exactly the reaction they wanted. If we run, what stops them from following? What stops them from using it as proof you can't even protect the people inside your own house, let alone your territory?" Duyun stared at her, something desperate and torn moving across his face. "I can't protect you from a car window 3 blocks from here, Kaiza. I can barely make it from this room to the garden without help. What good am I to either of you if I can't even?" "You're already protecting us," Kaiza cut in, kneeling before him, taking both his hands in hers without asking permission this time. You've spent this entire week rebuilding an army out of nothing but your mind and your will, because you refuse to let that man believe you've already lost. That's not nothing, Diyun. That is exactly the man my daughter draws pictures of. Don't lose faith in him 3 days before you get to prove it. He looked at their joined hands for a long moment, something in his throat working. 3 days, he repeated softly. And if it isn't enough, then we'll face that when it comes. Together. She squeezed his hands gently. You are not fighting this alone anymore, whether you like it or not. For the first time since she'd met him, Kang Diyun did not argue. The meeting was set for a warehouse near the docks, neutral ground, chosen by Oh Sang-chul precisely because it stripped away any advantage Diyun's home territory might have provided. Chul-Su argued fiercely against his boss attending in person, offering to go in his stead, but Diyun was immovable. If I send you, I confirm every fear they have, that I can't even show my own face to defend what's mine. I go. In the chair, in the open, and if they want to see weakness, I'll make them look twice before they decide that's what they're seeing. Keza was not meant to be there. She understood this, accepted it, and spent the hours of the meeting in an agony of waiting back at the house. Amara asleep upstairs, Mrs. Han sitting with her in tense, wordless solidarity, both women startling at every sound from the driveway. What happened at the warehouse, Keza pieced together only later from Chul-Su's account and, eventually, fragments Diyun himself was willing to share. Oh Sang-chul had arrived expecting to find a broken man, easily dismissed, and had instead found Kang Diyun waiting for him already positioned at the head of the room. Flanked by every ally Chul-Su had spent the week quietly resecuring. Men who owed old debts. Men who remembered exactly why they'd once feared the name Kang Diyun and needed only a reminder that the mind behind that fear remained entirely intact. You came to see if I could still stand, Diyun said, his voice carrying the particular steel Keza had heard only in glimpses over these past weeks. The voice, she suspected, of the man he'd been before the bullet. I can't. Not on my legs. But ask yourself, Oh Sang-chul, which part of me ever frightened you more, my legs, or what's behind my eyes? Because the second thing is still very much intact, and it has spent 6 months learning exactly how much of your operation depends on contracts I could unravel with 3 phone calls, favors I could call in that would leave you exposed on every side, and debts your own men owe me that I have, until now, chosen not to collect. Oh Sang-chul's confident sneer had faltered. According to Chul-Su, somewhere around the 3rd specific, damning piece of information Diyun produced, evidence of exactly which routes Oh Sang-chul's smuggling operation depended on, which officials he'd bribed, and how easily those bribes could be exposed, which of his own lieutenants had already quietly reached out to Chul-Su during the week, hedging their bets. You've spent 6 months waiting for me to be weak enough to take, Diyun continued, unrelenting. What you failed to account for is that I've spent that same 6 months relearning exactly how little of my power ever depended on my legs. Touch what's mine again, my territory, my people, or anyone in my household. And I promise you, the last thing that fails will be my mind. Do we understand each other? The silence that followed, Chul-Su said, had a weight to it he hadn't felt in the room in years. The old fear, the recognition of a man not to be tested, settling back over the assembled rivals like a physical thing. Oh Sang-chul left without another threat. Diyun returned home past midnight, exhausted in a way that went beyond the physical, and found Keza waiting in the hallway, having refused to sleep until she knew he was safe. It's done, he said simply, before she could ask. For now, he'll regroup, probably try something else eventually, men like him always do. But tonight, he left believing exactly what I needed him to believe. That you're still dangerous. That I never stopped being dangerous. Only that I'd forgotten it myself, for a while. He looked at her, something exhausted, and open and grateful in his expression that she had never seen there before. I couldn't have walked into that room believing it, if you hadn't made me believe it first. Keza closed the distance between them without fully deciding to, kneeling before his chair the way she had days before, taking his hands in hers. You believed it, she said softly. I just refused to let you forget. He looked down at their joined hands, and then, slowly, deliberately, up at her face, close enough now that she could see every fine detail of the exhaustion and relief, and something else, something warmer, moving behind his dark eyes. Keza, he said, her name rough and careful in his mouth, like something precious he wasn't sure he was allowed to hold. I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand I have not said anything like this to another human being in longer than I can remember. Then say it, she whispered. I think I have fallen in love with a woman who cleans my house and a 4-year-old who thinks I'm a king, and I do not know what to do with that, because I did not believe, 6 months ago, that there was anything left in me capable of feeling it. Keza felt her breath catch, felt the careful walls she'd built around her own heart, walls constructed after Juno, after the humiliation of being left alone and pregnant in a foreign country, walls she had told herself were permanent, begin, gently, irrevocably, to give way. I think, she said, her voice thick, that I fell in love with the man underneath the fury a while ago, and I've just been too afraid to say it, because loving you means loving all the danger that comes with you, and I have a daughter to protect. I will spend whatever is left of this life protecting both of you, Dune said, with a fierceness that left no room for doubt. Whatever that costs me. I promise you that. She leaned down, slowly, giving him every chance to close the distance himself if he chose to. And when their lips met, it was gentle and careful and utterly unlike the cold, furious man the household staff whispered about. It was the kiss of someone rediscovering, with wonder, that he was still capable of being loved and of loving in return. The months that followed were not without difficulty. Oh Sang-chul, true to Diyun's prediction, tested the boundaries of their fragile truce more than once, and there were tense weeks where Keza lay awake fearing another car window, another threat delivered with a smile. Chul-Su doubled the household's security. Diyun, now fully re-engaged with the empire he'd nearly let slip through his fingers, worked longer hours than ever, rebuilding what 6 months of grief and withdrawal had eroded. But something fundamental had shifted, and it showed in 1,000 small ways. He began physical therapy in earnest, not out of any renewed hope of walking again. The doctors were honest that the damage was likely permanent, but because Amara had asked him, with characteristic bluntness, whether he'd tried the exercise kind of medicine, because Mommy says exercise helps everything, and he had found himself, absurdly, unable to refuse a 4-year-old's logic. The house itself changed. Curtains that had stayed drawn for 6 months remained open, flooding rooms with light he'd once found unbearable. He ate meals at the table now, sometimes with Keza, always with an increasingly permanent fixture at his side, Amara's booster seat, purchased without discussion, simply appearing one day at Mrs. Han's quiet direction, as though the household had collectively decided the matter was settled. Keza moved out of the small staff room, first into a larger guest suite, and eventually, after a conversation that took Diyun 3 attempts to work up the courage to have, each attempt derailed by his own nerves in a way that made Keza laugh despite the gravity of what he was trying to ask, into the master wing itself, a shift the entire staff pretended not to notice with the particular discretion of people who were, in fact, delighted. I've faced down armed men without flinching, Diyun admitted to her one evening, months into their relationship, as they sat together in the garden watching Amara chase fireflies with the single-minded joy only childhood could summon. I have never in my life been as nervous as I was asking you to move your things into my room. You didn't even ask properly, Keza teased. You just said, very seriously, the guest wing gets cold in winter, and stared at me like you'd made some devastating strategic argument. It was strategic, he protested, though the corner of his mouth was fighting a smile. I am a very strategic man. You are a very in-love man who forgot how to use words for one evening. Keza corrected, and kissed the protest right off his face before he could argue further. Amara, catching sight of this from across the garden, ran over immediately, indignant at being left out. Is this a kissing time or a firefly time? She demanded, hands on her hips in an uncanny impression of Mrs. Hahn's most disapproving stance. Both, apparently, Dean said, and reached out to pull her onto his lap, settling her against his chest with the easy, practiced tenderness of a man who had, somewhere in the past year, become someone's father in every way that mattered, though no papers had yet been signed to make it official. Now, tell me about these fireflies. Are they friendly, or are we at war with them? Mr. Kong, Amara said, with the deep patience of a 4-year-old explaining something obvious to an adult who should really know better. Fireflies don't do war. They just make friends and light up. A wise philosophy, Diyun said gravely. Perhaps the wisest I've heard all year. Keza, watching the two of them, the once feared boss of the Beck Ho, cradling a giggling 4-year-old with a gentleness the underworld would never have believed him capable of, felt something settle in her chest that she recognized, with quiet astonishment, as home. The garden was different now, replanted, over the past year, with flowers Amara had chosen herself from a nursery catalog based entirely on which ones looked the happiest, resulting in a riot of color Dean's original, austere landscaping never would have permitted, and which he now claimed, with a straight face, to have designed himself. The wedding, when it finally happened, was small and quiet, exactly as Keza had wanted it. No grand announcement to the underworld, no display of power meant to remind anyone of anything, just family, close friends, Mrs. Han crying more than anyone expected, and Chul Su, standing as best man, delivering a toast so uncharacteristically sentimental that Dean threatened, only half joking, to dock his pay. Amara, 5 years old now and no less fearless than she'd been at 4, served as flower girl, though she abandoned her designated role within minutes to instead climb into Dean's lap during the ceremony itself, declaring loudly that kings need their princesses close by for important stuff. A pronouncement that drew laughter from every guest and, from Dean, an expression of such open, undefended joy that Keza had to look away to keep from crying through her own vows. The adoption papers were signed 3 months later. Amara had asked, with characteristic directness, whether this meant Diyun was really, actually her father now, and had cried. Happy tears, the kind that come from a child's whole small body, when he told her yes, that he had, in fact, been trying to be her father since the day she'd asked him if his wheelchair was comfy, and that the papers only made official what had been true in every way that mattered for a long time already. Oh Sang-chul, in the end, never made another move. Word had spread, in the particular way words spread through Seoul's underworld, that Kang Diyun had not merely survived the attempt to unseat him. He had emerged from it stronger, sharper, and more formidable than before, precisely because he had stopped trying to hide what had happened to him and had instead built something new out of the wreckage, an empire still respected, still feared where fear was warranted, but run now by a man who had learned, in the hardest way possible, the difference between power that isolated and power that protected. He still could not walk. He never would again. But he had stopped, somewhere in that year, measuring his worth by what his legs could do, and started measuring it instead by the family gathered around him each evening. A wife who had walked into his darkest room and refused to let him disappear into it, and a daughter who had seen, before anyone else in the world had thought to look, that a king could still be a king even from a wheelchair, as long as someone loved him enough to remind him. On quiet evenings, when the house had settled and Amara was long asleep, Keza would sometimes find her husband in the garden, looking up at the stars with an expression of peace so complete it still occasionally startled her, remembering the furious, broken man she'd first encountered behind that study door. "What are you thinking about?" she asked him once, settling into the chair beside his. "That I spent 30 years of my life believing power meant never needing anyone," he said quietly. "And I lost more in 6 months of believing that than I ever lost to a bullet." He reached for her hand, threading their fingers together with the easy familiarity of a year of practice. Nobody cared whether the crippled Mafia boss lived or died, Keza. Not really. Not until a housekeeper and her impossible, fearless daughter walked into my life and decided, without asking my permission, that I was worth caring about anyway. "She always did have excellent taste in kings," Keza said softly, and rested her head against his shoulder. And together they watched the stars over Seoul, a family built from nothing but grief and stubbornness and love, exactly the way the strongest things always are.